Welcome to Curious Mammal. I want to explore all of the diplomacy behind the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, all the negotiations, peace talks, offers, and threats, those that happened before the war broke out, and those that have happened after. Understanding these negotiations is really important, because this conflict will either end in the destruction of Ukraine as an independent state, it's not seeming so likely now, or, what's much more likely, a negotiated settlement. Without first looking at a brief history of the peoples of Ukraine and Russia, it will be very difficult to understand what motivates the factions on each side and how they might reach that negotiated settlement. So we will aim to cover just enough history to make sense of modern negotiations and diplomacy. We'll cover ancient history only briefly, but we'll spend a lot more time looking at events of the 20th century. We will start in earnest in 1600. Before that, though, in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, we saw the weakening of the Mongol hordes and the rise of Poland, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. Here you can see the borders of modern Ukraine against this map of the world in 1600. What is today modern Ukraine was then Poland, Russia, and the Crimean Khanate. A remnant of the retreating Mongols, the Crimean Khanate was living in much of what is now southeastern Ukraine. These Khans had ceased their nomadic lifestyle, and the majority of the free population was Turkic-speaking and practiced Islam. They would become a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire in 1475. After 1524, Khans of the Crimean Khanate would be directly appointed by the Ottoman Sultan. They generally did not pay tribute to the Ottomans, though, or taxes. Instead, the Ottomans actually paid them for their outriders in military campaigns. Crimean Tatars often launched raids on neighboring provinces and maintained a massive slave trade with the Ottoman Empire, fueled by peasants that they would catch on the plains of Ukraine. The raids were constant, though the Tatars would often switch between alliances with the Poles or Russia, peace with one while raiding the other. Their tactics were rather complex. Raiding armies would be mounted, each horseman armed with a saber, a bow, and 20 arrows, often having a backup horse. They would fan out across the countryside in groups of 100 or less, looking for poorly defended villages. They would enslave or kill the entire village, killing those they deemed too old to work, laying with the women and young boys, and tying and branding all before leading them back to one of the slave ports in Crimea. If they ran into a major army, they would try to draw it away from major populated areas by raiding surrounding lands, or have the Tatar main force of 20 to 30,000 horsemen tie them up in combat, while smaller detachments would raid in the rear. A 17th century writer wrote that there were some 920,000 Ukrainian slaves living in Crimea amongst the 187,000 free Muslims. These frequent raids, often called the harvesting of the steppe, made enemies of the Polish, the Ukrainians, and the Belarusians. The Zaporožski, or the Ukrainian Cossacks, formed a military-political system called the Zaporožski Siege. Its principal reason for being was to create a military force capable of resisting Tatar raids, though they would do raiding of their own. The Zaporožski Siege was organized into what we today would call a republic, with the highest authority being the Siege Rada, a legislative body that would elect a Kish Ottoman, or the supreme military leader. The Ottoman was the supreme military leader with a term of 1 year, and Ottoman and Hetman were mostly interchangeable terms until the establishment of the Hetmanate in 1648, which was mostly a military dictatorship, where the Hetman was no longer necessarily in agreement with the Rada or its leaders. The origin of the Cossacks was also in the Mongol hordes. They were excellent horsemen, and they would have their numbers swell over the 16th century, bolstered by serfs fleeing from more northern parts of Poland and later from Russia. The Ukrainian Cossacks were part of the Polish Empire, yet they were largely autonomous. They weren't directly administered by the Poles. However, they still resented Polish rule, largely due to religious differences. The Cossacks were Orthodox Christian, while the Poles were Catholic, and even the few restrictions on their autonomy, especially restrictions on how large a registry or an army they might have, were sources of bitter complaint. Meanwhile, the Don Cossacks were based along the Don River in what is now eastern Ukraine. They were similar to the Zaporozhye or the Ukrainian Cossacks in that they were excellent horsemen, but rather than alternating between alliances with Poland, Russia, and occasionally the Crimean Khanate, they were principally aligned to Russia, though they would have several major rebellions for independence from Russian rule. But they were afforded large amounts of autonomy, and they didn't pay taxes to the Tsar. Instead, Russia was satisfied with having them defend their southern border and being able to call upon them in times of war. Land in what is eastern Ukraine today, in 1600, was under the control of Lithuanians and Poles, who had taken it from the Mongols in the 14th century, and much of it was organized into the voivodeship of Kiev. In 1648, Bohdan Khmelnytsky named himself hetman, or military leader, and began a Cossack uprising against the Polish Commonwealth forces. They allied with the Crimean Tatars, and the Crimean Tatars had been gradually losing power in the region in the 17th century as their raiding was becoming progressively less effective against the better armed Cossack and Russian forces. But the assistance of the Crimean Tatars was critical to many of the early military successes of the Ukrainian Cossacks. And with the support of the Cossacks, the Tatars collected much plunder and many slaves from the Poles, including slaves from surrendered armies. In fact, in one instance, the Zaporozhye Cossacks actually purchased slaves back from the Crimean Tatars and executed them after a battle. However, upon achieving all of this military success and winning an independent sovereign state, this hetman realized his new position, that of being squeezed between the great powers, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Tsardom of Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. As such, the hetman was looking for a protector, someone that would help defend them from their other neighbors while granting them adequate autonomy. Khmelnytsky found that in the Russian Tsar, who offered them a largely autonomous government, protection from Russia, and freedom to continue practicing Orthodox Christianity, aligned to the Patriarch of Constantinople rather than Moscow. However, signing this treaty would be the cause of the Russo-Polish War of 1654 to 1657, since in the eyes of the Polish crown, the Ukrainian land was rightfully part of the Polish Empire once they could put down the rebellion. The Cossacks would fight alongside the Russian Tsar against Poland until an armistice was signed in 1656, after the Swedes under Charles X invaded Poland. Yet a year later, in 1957, a new hetman would be elected after Khmelnytsky's death, Ivan Vyovsky. Vyovsky turned on Moscow and allied with Poland, creating the Grand Duchy of Ruthenia. However, his alliance would trigger a civil war within the Cossacks, where Yuri Khmelnytsky, the son of Bohdan, would realign with Russia. However, in the Battle of Konotrop, Yuri was captured by the Poles and would pledge allegiance to them. This perceived treason of Yuri would provoke yet another civil war in 1661, where Samko led pro-Moscow Cossacks against Yuri and his Polish allies, defeating them. The Russo-Polish War ultimately ended with the Treaty of Andrusovo, where much Polish-Ukrainian land was ceded to Russia, though most of the western Ukrainian lands was returned to Poland, and Russia maintained control of eastern portions, including Kiev. 1700 saw the further weakening of the Crimean Khanate, with Russian and Ukrainian forces being far too strong for raiding to be profitable. This resulted in the signing of the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, which outlawed further raiding. In 1687, Ivan Mazepa was elected hetman of the left bank, or eastern Ukraine adjacent to Kiev. He would take advantage of a failed revolt in western Ukraine against the Poles along the right bank to annex much of Polish Ukraine. Mazepa, however, would grow to become frustrated with Tsar Peter, since the Cossack forces were committed in the north during the Great Northern War starting in 1700, fighting a long way from home and sustaining many losses against the much more advanced militaries of the Swedes, morale in his army was terrible. Further, lands in Ukraine were left undefended against the Poles and the Tatars. This would come to a head when Poland threatened to attack Ukraine, and Peter refused to commit any significant forces to defend it, instead believing all forces were needed to defend against the Swedes in the north. Ivan Mazepa then switched sides, claiming that the treaty that bound Ukraine to Russia required that the Tsar defend Ukraine from invasion, so Ivan would ally with the advancing Swedish and Polish armies. However, only 3,000 Cossacks followed him, with the rest remaining loyal to Russia. Indeed, the support of the Ukrainian groups was very much divided. However, the Zaporozhsky Sich did support him, much to their dismay later, since Peter the Great would win a decisive victory against the Swedes in the Battle of Poltava. By the end of the conflict, Peter would sack and raze several Cossack cities, including their capital of Baytern, and the Sich itself. The Hetmanate government would nominally survive this conflict with Russia, though 900 Cossacks that were thought to be loyal to Mazepa were executed as part of a purge, and the region became included under the Russian Kiev regional government. In the 1730s, despite the treaty ending Tatar raids, Tatars resumed raiding the Ukrainian lands. This would lead Russian and Cossack forces to attack the Khanate in the Chagrin and Crimean campaigns. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1735 to 1739, Russians managed to penetrate the Crimean Peninsula itself, devastating towns and leaving nothing in their wake but ashes. Ultimately, though, they were forced to withdraw from much of the conquered lands due to disease and starvation within the army. Catherine II would later fight again in Crimea in 1768, accompanied by Cossack forces, and would decisively win the war, resulting in making the Crimean Khanate independent from the Ottoman Empire but aligned to Russia. She would later intervene in the Crimean Civil War in 1783, this time outright annexing Crimea. With the Crimean Tatars conquered, the Zaporozhsky Cossacks had no place anymore as a semi-independent state, and in 1775, Catherine II decreed that the Zaporozhsky Sich be destroyed, and the lands of the Zaporozhian host was now far from being a protectorate of the Russian Empire. It was now under full administrative control of the Russian Empire. As the 18th century drew to a close, 3 wars and 3 partitions of Poland between Prussia, Russia, and Austria-Hungary would ultimately result in the complete annexation of all Polish lands by these powers. The first would occur in 1772, the second in 1793, and the final and at this point inevitable partition of the then crippled Poland was in 1795. This would result in large increases in the territory of the Russian Empire in the west, both on the northern and the southern front. The turn of the 19th century would also see Napoleon Bonaparte come to power and crown himself Emperor of France in 1804. Napoleon was a man of rather unique military genius, and while other nations required coordination between generals, approvals of their own kings, and even coordination between kings, being an emperor and a general in the field, Napoleon was able to apply the full force of an entire empire behind each of his maneuvers. He had wanted peaceful relations with Russia and had been forming a strong relationship with Russian Tsar Paul I. However, Paul I was assassinated by his general, and his son Alexander I would come to power. Alexander was much more cold in French relations. On one hand, Russia and France were both natural allies, since a weakened Central Europe would mean spoils for both of the powers at the most, and at the least it would prevent the scattered German states of the Holy Roman Empire from becoming united under 1 or 2 flags, and being so weakened it would mean a secure border for both Russia and France. But Alexander I was angered by some of Napoleon's recent maneuvers, and the continuing consolidation of French power. He would end up leading Russia to join with Britain, states of the Holy Roman Empire, and others in a war against Napoleon in the War of the Third Coalition in 1805. Yet Russia would lose two major battles decisively to Napoleon that would ultimately decide the fate of that war. The first was the Battle of Austerlitz, where Napoleon was able to lure a primarily Russian army of 80,000 men into a trap. Napoleon had baited a weak southern line, which the Russian coalition forces saw and made haste to attack. Napoleon rapidly mobilized his army to overwhelm the center of the Russian army, thereby enveloping the forces that had been sent to take his weak southern flank. This would be one of Napoleon's great victories, where his force of 70,000 men effectively destroyed an army of 80,000 men, suffering only moderate casualties themselves. The second battle at Friedland was also a decisive win for Napoleon, with his army of 80,000 destroying the Allied forces of 50,000. The general failure of the Third Coalition War resulted in the Treaty of Tilsit, where Napoleon and Alexander met in the middle of the Neman River to discuss terms of peace. This treaty would secure Napoleon's hold over Central Europe by creating sister states that were nominally independent, but were aligned to France, such as the Duchy of Warsaw and the Kingdom of Westphalia. Meanwhile, Russia agreed to join the continental system. Normally, an embargo was enforced by ships controlling ports, but Napoleon had envisaged this in reverse, whereby British ships and goods wouldn't be allowed into any continental European ports. Essentially a land blockade, with the idea of crippling the British economy by denying them markets for goods from their colonial empire. However, the continental blockade would prove highly ineffective, as neutral ships would continue to run British goods to ports, and it would be a source of much resentment for many of Napoleon's allies, including Russia. Russia used this time of peace with France, though, to expand in the Caucasus and in the Balkans during the Russo-Ottoman War, a war which France had pledged to help in, but ended up getting cold feet. The Russian-French alliance would drift farther and farther apart, starting in 1810 and culminating in another war in 1812. Napoleon had grown frustrated by Russia renouncing the continental system, which had caused her much economic damage, and Russia was upset with Napoleon's consolidation of power in Central Europe, especially in the Duchy of Warsaw, which Russia coveted and was worried that the Duchy of Warsaw would become a launching point of an invasion of the motherland. As ultimatums were issued and left unfulfilled, Napoleon, realizing there would be a war, quickly mobilized. In many ways, this scenario was the penultimate nightmare of Russian leaders before Alexander I, a unified Europe fighting against Russia. In blue, you can see all of the states which supported Napoleon, either being directly controlled by French administration, being sister states that were allied, or independent states that were allied to Napoleon. Napoleon advanced on Russia with one of the largest armies ever assembled. However, Russian generals would not give him a square fight, instead slowing Napoleon's advance, then retreating and leaving only wastes for Napoleon to lay claim to. Extensive harassment of Napoleon's now drawn-out supply lines from Russian light cavalry, and muddy roads which ruined Napoleon's well-planned-out logistics system, Napoleon had much trouble supplying his army. Through sickness, heat, and then cold, hunger, and harassment by Russian forces with the occasional battle, Napoleon's Grande Armée, which entered Russia with 600,000 men, would only be 100,000 strong when they entered Moscow, to find the city of Moscow mostly evacuated and furthermore set to flame. With the winter coming, there was nothing left for Napoleon to do but to return west. By the end of the invasion, almost 1 million lives of both French and Russian forces would be lost. Importantly, Russia's strategy, which proved to be successful, was using its vast lands as a military resource. By having underdeveloped infrastructure and by despoiling lands while retreating, Russia could weaken an enemy army, stretching out their supply lines, eventually having them succumb to cold, hunger, and disease. Unlike most European countries, Russia being so large, it can afford to give up huge swaths of land while still having ample lands in the rear to supply and reinforce armies. But having lands in Eastern Europe to serve as a buffer zone has been a core part of Russian geopolitical strategy. These lands provide such a buffer that can be despoiled in the event of an invasion. It's worth noting that this Russian strategy of defense in depth has perhaps made it the country in continental Europe which has avoided conquest by external enemies the longest, for Russia hasn't been conquered since the time of the Mongols in the 13th century. Perhaps only Great Britain can really compare, since they have avoided successful foreign invasion since the times of William the Conqueror in the 11th century. The core British military strategy has been to prevent consolidation of power in Central Europe, and secondly, to dominate the seas to protect their island home from land invasion. Britain has also shown through the centuries that it is willing to declare war and to shed blood to protect these strategic pillars, as they did against Napoleon. For Russia, that strategic advantage isn't an island moat, but a land moat, which it has also shown in history that it has quite an appetite for and is also willing to shed blood for. After Napoleon's return from Elba and defeat again at Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna would broker a peace that would last for almost 40 years in Europe. Though it was called a Congress, it was much more a meeting of the delegates from monarchies. The major outcomes of the Congress were that the powers principally responsible for the defeat of Napoleon, Prussia, Austria, and the Russian Empire, made substantial territorial gains, though the spoils were handed out in a manner such that the great powers could balance each other and hopefully remain at peace. Another major outcome was reaffirmed commitment of the monarchs to block republicanism and revolutionism that had marked the French Revolution and had almost upended the monarchical systems of the governments of Europe. Tsar Alexander would form the Holy Alliance, making the monarchic empires of Austria, Prussia, and Russia conservative defenders of the status quo, a bastion of defense against democracy, revolutionism, and secularism. However, things which do not bend often break, and in a century, Russian monarchs would soon find that they had lost the support of most of the population. Yet there was still some significant domestic policy reform within Russia. A state council was formed in 1810 by Alexander I. While it was responsible for lawmaking, it had very little actual power, since all of the laws had to be approved by the monarch, who could side with the majority or the minority, or be of their own mindset entirely. Another major event in the 19th century was in 1861, serfdom was abolished by Alexander II. Serfdom was a form of slavery where slaves were tied to the land, though in practice they were still sold sometimes. Not wanting to create a disgruntled, landless, agitated proletariat class, with this freedom the serfs were also given land. And though it differed greatly, generally it was about half of the land that they had been working as serfs. They were required to pay for this land, though, with interest over the course of 49 years. Furthermore, they weren't able to sell this land, so in principle, many serfs were still tied to the land until the land was paid off with interest to the state. We will end this video here, though. From 1600 to 1900, we have seen the lands of modern Ukraine giving home to both the Tatar slavers and to those fighting them off. It was home to a proto-republic, a Ukrainian state that was often switching allegiances, searching for protection from foreign powers on one hand, but autonomy on the other. As a result of this politicking and the many wars fought, borders and rulers of modern Ukrainian land would shift many times in the centuries. The lands of Ukraine also contained many escaped serfs, seeking freedom after leaving more authoritarian regimes in Russia or Poland. And later, as Ukraine lost autonomy after failed rebellions, it began to have the same feudal systems where many were repressed back into serfdom, only to be freed again. So thanks for watching. I'm just getting started building this channel. I aim to make a new video every week covering different things that interest me, ranging from history and geopolitics like this video, all the way up to science, technology, and policy. So if you liked this video and want to see more, please let me know by hitting like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.